Yeah, sorry for missing the stuff yesterday. I just had some errands to run, and for the rest of it, I wanted to take a day off. And beyond that, let's start out this with getting on to posting my uh, Patreon up in the in the chats. It's also in the bottom of the description that you'll see. For this one, we're going to go on the topic of why news media is focusing on why news media focuses on why news media focusing on sensationalism is not a new idea for profit, and this is really this really can go back to the Jack the Ripper case, and it goes back about 131 years to date. And if you look back at the Jack the Ripper case with it, you could see that with the news coverage, you'll see that there was a lot of news coverage by tabloids within. This was essentially how this actually changed the news media coverage at the time, and what we actually see to date. And that was essentially, there used to be before that point, this is in the late 1880s, before that point, and this is actually in the United Kingdom, but it kind of leached everywhere, because it really changed the way that we see the actual the way we actually see the news media reporting the facts, and why they actually report in such a way. And this was basically, they changed from what they're actually doing. They changed to actually reporting just for money. Now, they would even go as far as to say, hey, we've got this newspaper with facts about Jack the Ripper, and in fact, there was no stories about Jack the Ripper in the paper, and it was just to sell a paper, make a quick buck, and the people were going to be pissed. And meanwhile, they've made quite a few dollars off that back in the late 1880s. Well, what they're doing, they've really kind of continue the practice now, and it doesn't matter if you want to call it fake news now with it, but what they're doing is they're really, in that case, that would be equal to what we're calling clickbait now, to gather information on news stories, and they're still going with that method. But what they're also doing is they're sensationalizing stories which really do not need to be sensationalized. They're changing around details to basically fit certain narratives. Essentially, you can, if you don't report the actual details in a direct manner, you can actually change a story to be viewed in almost infinite ways if you want to actually add a spin on a story just by the wording that you give. And that's essentially creating a fake narrative. You could, and just by changing around just a few words on quotes, taking a few words out and adding ... in between, you technically have not removed any of the context out of the quote, but you essentially just pulled out words with it, and it makes it look like the quote's longer with it, and you didn't want to quote the whole thing, and you could essentially make someone's quote look like something horrible or something better than it really was. Now, this shifts the basic idea of the way what someone's actually stating. Now, you can make them look horrible by removing negative words like no or not or isn't, and you could essentially remove those by putting ... in between, and that's perfectly legal under journalistic standards. Well, that means that you're essentially taking something completely out of context, and because of what you're doing, because of that little thing of saying, well, we're not going to quote the whole piece, and we're only going, but you're actually using it just to take out one or two words. Now that will not, now for what the reader's perspective is, that changes the actual whole perception of the quote. And this is where we get to the idea of trying to sensationalize the actual piece, and you're trying to create a narrative on that. And this is what they've done now. It could be because the media company has an actual political ideology. Now this happens a lot, or in the case that they're trying to earn extra money because they're trying to stir up a lot of controversy on something that doesn't have any controversy. And they could state, oh, I never stated that, and then it creates this he said, she said on these specifically in written pieces. Now in video pieces, it's not as easy, and it makes it a little more difficult, especially. But they can still do that through editing. They can edit out certain pieces and make it look bad. Specifically, they can't do real choppy editing, but they can edit out certain pieces and make it out to make it look like someone looks really bad, that they want to make look bad, or someone make really good that they want to make someone make someone look better that they that really look really bad. And this is easily done. We see the news media doing this constantly. I mean, if you see the original content next to what actually aired, you'll see the difference. I mean, someone that wouldn't look normally with it. I mean, that would look normal next to their blowouts that were not caught on air. Take for instance, someone that looked bad on the blowout that didn't hit air was Lawrence O'Donnell. Lawrence O'Donnell, the newscaster. This was something that basically where someone took his little freak out blowout on the, what do you call that, stop the hammering. That someone took that freak out and took that feed, which was not meant to air, which was in between segments, and they put it out on social media, and it made him look like a complete and utter lunatic. Now, this is basically taking so you get the full context of what one of his shows is like. Next to maybe it was a bad night or something, but the fact is you get the full context. Next to when they start to do like when Megyn Kelly was trying to do an interview with Alex Jones. Well, what she was doing, she was essentially using her editors to take things out of context. Now, what ended up happening was Alex Jones made sure to be smart and actually do audio recording of it so that he could essentially get ahead of her and release 100% of the audio recording. Now, this is what a lot of people have done, and they make sure to do this in the one-party consent states, and this is very important. And so the other party can't say, oh, but you aired that without my consent, and you jumped the gun on before this thing could air, and all these other things like that. Well, the fact is if you do on a one-party consent state, which means all you have to do is have one of the two parties in the interview consent, which means either the party filming or the party being filmed, in what it called in who's out, or either the party recording or the party being recorded consents to it, which obviously it's always going to be consented. Then it goes by. that means there's never going to be any litigation on it. And since they did this down in Texas, Texas is one of them. New York is another, and there's a few other states that have this. And this is why why what ends up happening is they can use editing as another tool to do this, and this is basically for sensationalism, because they want to basically make certain people out to be these evil villains, certain people out to be these big heroes, and the way they make them out to be these big heroes is what they'll do is they'll use editing in the same way, but they'll use it and they'll flip it. They'll basically take out negative things that they've stated, and they'll basically remove those from the context, because those are very, very bad for people to hear. So what they'll do is they'll cut those out of the interview, and they will obviously what they do is they want to make sure these interviews aren't fully live, because they want to make sure that they're cutting those out, because if they were to, then you would get very, very negative outcomes. Look, for instance, a lot of things in Hillary Clinton. When you get these stage interviews like that, Hillary Clinton was looking positive, but when you were getting interviews, when you were getting these complete open mic things on Hillary Clinton, you were getting her stating things, stating that anybody even considering voting for Donald Trump was a deplorable human being, and we're getting her stating that she wanted to essentially start World War III. Well, that's not a way to win an election. That's a way to essentially torch your campaign. And that's essentially what happened. And if I were a member of it, I would have basically held my head down and was like, what the hell is going on? And this is why what the media does is the media tries to establish these narratives, and this is basically what the legacy media, or if you want to call them the mainstream media, I prefer legacy media because it refers to basically discontinued products of companies, because they're basically, as far as we can pretty much see it, they're pretty much dead. Nobody watches them anymore. Nobody pays attention to them anymore. They consider them to be propaganda, and very, very few people even pay attention to most of what any of them say. And since people have been going into for TV, cutting the cord, and even on their social media platforms, nobody can even, none of them can even get any headroom when it comes down to it, as for their news spreading with it, so they're not getting exactly any headroom for that, beyond a couple of individual personalities, but that's about it. And when it comes to the actual spreading of news, most people tend to view them in a very, very negative light, regardless of political ideology. I mean, even people, when you look at most of the American legacy media, most of them actually tend to side with the left wing. And we're seeing that even with that is even the people on the left even have a negative feeling of them. They don't even make it up to 50%. And this is something that should be very, very troubling to them. If they can't even make it up to 50% on those people, they're doing something seriously wrong. And it means that they're doing something so bad that they can't even get those people on board. So, and then when we get back to this idea with it, this is basically, I mean, when we go back on the idea of history is basically showing that they've been doing this thing for a long time. This is not a new idea. It's just what's the new idea is, I would say that people, that due to more sources out there, and people actually kind of from these independent groups and from the citizen journalism, I think what we're finding is people are grasping onto those people, so the idea of the term of fake news, essentially, which was initially weaponized by the legacy media themselves to go after citizen journalism and independent journalism to try and create this separation. Eventually, what it became is it turned out as a boomerang effect. So the idea of it was that they wanted to essentially say anything that doesn't fit this narrow band of sensational journalism, which was basically a mix of basically propaganda and really kind of edited statements to fit certain agendas on stories, whether it was to make money or fit a political agenda. It was basically, if someone was actually just going back to the original journalism standards that we actually had to this point previous 130 years ago, then they were actually branded. Then they were trying to brand these people as fake news. Well, they're not. They're not the ones issuing this, and it's what it is projection. And this is something that basically we're seeing essentially a break, and I think it's something that's going to eventually cause a change out there. And what really needs to be understood is this is really not something that's new. It's just what's happening is, I think it's more that people are kind of getting sick of it. People kind of have become more aware since the 1970s of it. Previous to the point, they just were completely oblivious because there wasn't the other options out there. People were just complacent from from about the late 1800s on to about through the 1960s, and until the 1970s had hit, they just were not really open to accepting the idea that it was all propaganda and it was all garbage, and that everything was essentially crap. Now we've gotten to the point to where we've accepted the idea that there are these people out there that can offer us an alternative, which is actually sped the course of things. And I think that's actually because of the internet, and that's given many more people a platform, and we have people that can actually go out there and actually grab the news. They can actually go by foot, grab local news on their own, get that, videotape it, go back and actually do a report on it, or actually have a little tiny little team do a report on it, and do it from an actual legitimate manner in the way it was originally meant to be. And people realize, okay, I'm a lot happier with that. Okay, the production quality might not be as good as ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, Fox, so on and so forth. But even though it's not, it gives me essentially what I'm looking for when it comes down to the actual group of what I'm looking for the actual content. I'm getting the content I want, maybe not the quality, but if I keep supporting it, their quality is going to get better. It's probably not going, because the competition is very, very fierce. It's probably not going to get to the quality of the others, but that's something that's is going to be it's always going to be this kind of raw quality, but it's probably going to be part of its charm to begin with. And there's always going to be new people popping up, which is going to always keep these people on their toes. And it's always and once the legacy media dies out, unless the governments try to fund them, which is probably going to be an action that they're going to try to do. These ones, ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, Fox, who else? All these other ones they're out there. They're going to basically say we need bailouts because these small channels are killing us, and that's what's going to happen. And then even beyond what's the social media groups are actually giving them boosts by actually putting them and saying that they're legitimate news when they're not, and when they're just merely basically looking for profit and not even producing anything legitimate. And everybody knows that they haven't for over 130 years. And nobody alive has ever seen something legitimate from them. And this is something that, when we look historically, we need to understand. We need to understand that this is about it's about making money, because basically what they're looking for is essentially a business model that will essentially make money for them. They basically make money when they essentially spit out state propaganda. This is basically when they say, "Oh, look at those pretty bombs that the government's launching." Basically, if now media is supposed to be a check on the government. Now, when they're not a check on the government, they make money. When they are a check on the government, they don't make any money. Now, this is basically if they don't make any money from that. Now, basically, what ends up happening, they only make money is if they get kind of get a kickback from an actual government agency that wanted them to do that, which makes the which is why the Nixon thing becomes very, very suspect. That's why a lot of people are very suspect of that of those Nixon tapes, because the fact is we know that there was technology to splice audio, number one, and number two, we know that mainstream media does not go against government propaganda because of money. There's money in that. We know that when we were looking at the thing with it, we know that they didn't that war was popular. War is popular for both headlines on the news, number one, and number two is war is popular for the government itself, for its military contractors, and it likes these. So basically, if there's one person out there who basically opposes it as a leader, they're probably going to want them out. So what they're going to want is there's a certain level of government propaganda out there, and this is why a lot of us are very, very suspect of that. Not necessarily that it's necessarily true that they did do this, but it is very, very questionable, because essentially what the media makes money on is government propaganda, because the state essentially hands out money for them basically doing this. We've seen this historically. We've seen them hand out money when during the 1980s, when they were doing war films. They were essentially giving money out to directors, and they were saying this is for art. This is under the for helping out these art films. Now, what were these art films? Films like Rambo, films like Commando, and we see films like this where they were basically getting a bunch of money from the government. Well, why? Well, because they wanted to ensure, and then we were also seeing it in different things like animation as well, with like things like G.I. Joe as well. We were seeing the WWF make money as well with when they were starting to bring in characters like for propaganda against with the Cold War, with with Sergeant Slaughter and Nikolai Volkov. Now this essentially is when they start making money and they go, oh, we're trying to help out the arts. Well, that's not what it's for. That's the money's actually coming out of Department of Defense. Well, if you're trying to help out the arts, why is the money coming out of Department of Defense? And what it actually comes out to is that this is not what it's for. And if the media were actually legitimate, they would have actually reported that this is propaganda. But the fact is the media also got its money for actually going through and saying, oh, these are great films and we recommend you go out and see them. And well, because the fact is it means more money for those films. It means that they can keep this gravy train running. Now, that was the actual purpose. And so they got their money back, and they continued on. And in many cases with it, they then on their entertainment side would then replay these films, and they're making more money on those when the government says, well, can you play these films on a replay with it? And okay, let's work out a deal for all these things with this, and then they get their kickback, and then the original people get their original developers get their kickback, and it works out to the same thing as a repeat. And this is what ends up happening, and it's that's how they get their money for the propaganda. And that's what they were doing back then. Now, that's why it extended even further. Well, people got very, very wary during the 70s and 80s of them doing this stuff, because it just seemed very, very suspicious that they were doing this for the military. Of any time they wanted more soldiers, basically it would be another one of these films would automatically pop up, and it would just be out of nowhere, and they would basically tend to milk a series to death. And then, it's out of nowhere with it when they want more soldiers and another war to pop up with it, and more interest in a war to pop up. All of a sudden, they would basically, out of nowhere, they would start to bring up some of these the old Rambo movie, and that this was essentially what they did, and they did this recently, and that this is what they were doing, and they would basically do this specifically, and this is kind of the idea with it. And they would even use other movies to essentially bring during that period of the 70s and 80s to kind of push this idea of that Cold War, but even if they weren't involved in military conflict, that they would essentially try to push the idea of this idea of the United States versus Russia. I mean, they did it in even with Rocky. I mean, it ends up getting to be very, very pathetic when it comes to that. And it needs to be understood that that's kind of the point, that what they're pushing. Now, what needs to be done is we need to understand that that this is kind of the point, that what will end up that they use as one of their streams of money. Now, if they're looking for legitimacy, they would basically say, if the media is looking for legitimacy, they would say, okay, we're not taking any of this money. We're only looking for reporting the truth. Well, we can see that basically the truth is actually popular, and it's allowed for different independent and citizen journalists to actually grab a lot of views on social media, and it actually develops money. Well, the fact is they don't they haven't grasped that idea. They're still stuck in this old business model that is really pretty much well over 100 years old. Essentially, we're talking this business models that they've been using, which is a mix of pushing propaganda from the government and spreading sensationalism, is approximately about, what are we talking, 105 years old or something, 110 years old. Or I think it's like 105 years old about right now. So we're talking, it was about around the time of World War One, or just before. So we're talking that's when we're looking at that, is this is something that ends up going back to something that's is what they tend to rely upon, and that's something that they've done. And they've done this idea of mixing that with mixing in the that was kind of their period that they've kind of gotten stuck in, and they have not modernized beyond accepting in new technology. Well, they're very, very backward in the way that they do this. They've just basically said, okay, we need to take our same model and implant it into new technology. And that's basically what they've done. And they've done nothing more. And their idea is anytime we have someone that actually competes with us, we need to essentially blast them as being fake or being problematic, so that the owners of that new technology take them off the air. And that's their whole problem, and that's where this whole thing comes from. And we need to realize that essentially that they're really illegitimate, and they've gotten to that point. And this is why when they've gotten to the point of sensationalism, they've kind of reached the end point, and they've realized that, because their streams of money have come basically to the end point. And they're starting to realize that, because they're going into actually having people attack the independent journalists and citizen journalists that are actually doing real work. And they're willing to essentially try to ruin those people's lives, because they've essentially reached the because groups like CNN and so forth have actually reached the end of the line, and they realize that they're dead, and they're basically zombie media, and they can't go any further. And because without a massive overhaul, they're not going to change. And they have a bunch of overpaid personalities. I mean, why are you paying people 7 figures that no one watches? I mean, does that make any sense? Why would you pay 7 figures to someone that nobody watches, that peddles conspiracy theories, that basically has become the butt of people's jokes? I mean, that should be basically those should be people that you should be firing and saying, get the hell out of here. We're not paying you a damn cent. And restructuring your actual whole business model. Your business model should be basically copying exactly what those citizen journalists are doing, and what the independent journalists are doing. Rely on they should have been studying up on what the cord cutting has been impacting onto the market, not trying to fight it. Fighting it has only caused them more problems, because cutting other people from their companies doesn't help. You need to cut actually on-air talent that is actually useless. Start cutting people like Don. If you're CNN, start cutting people like Don Lemon. Start cutting people like Anderson Cooper that nobody watches. When you start cutting people like Cuomo. When you start cutting people like that are well overpaid, you're going to have a lot of free money, and start looking for people that are actually independent journalists, start trying to bring them in and work toward lower salaries, because you're not going to be able to afford it, and you're going to have to go to dropping the television platform and going to online platforms, and try going to things like cord cutting options, Roku, Amazon, options like those. drop the idea of TV unless you're going to work with independent ones that are offering streaming services, such as like a Spectrum or something. Work with something like that, or other streaming streaming TV services. Drop the idea of TV, because the fact is it's not worth it. It's very, very expensive for an actual station to continue up with that. And it's a dying thing with it. Most companies are going away from that, because it's pretty much dying as it is with it. There's not much left of it, and nobody wants the big boxes anymore for cable or satellite anymore. Everybody wants the little sticks or the smart TVs, and that's what everybody's going towards. And or they want to watch it off their computer, and that's what everybody's doing. And everybody's saying bye bye to expensive TV. And then work on seeing if you can't link up with Hulu and other things like that. Start reducing your cost of your people, because those people, you can't pay people 7 figures anymore. That's too damn expensive. Because especially if nobody watches them, why are you paying them that type of money? Because you need to look at from a business aspect of why would you pay someone 7 figures when they're not worth anywhere close to that amount of money? That's completely insane. You should be paying them probably no more than 1/10 of that price. You should be paying them about between $100,000 to maybe $150,000. Some of them, they're paying several $1,000,000 with it. Sometimes they're paying them between 7 to 8 figures a year. You should never be paying media salaries on TV that kind of price. No media personality is worth that on TV nowadays. You should be looking closer to guys on about $100 and so on $1,000 a year, because it's not worth it. And then you can create some type of incentive for whatever excess revenue is generated in by some type of company ownership, and some type of stock ownership, and that could be a better option for your people. But to actually state that you're going to be paying people 7 to 8 figures a year is insane. I mean, when we start to look at Don Lemon's salary, he said back in 2002 he was he had an annual salary of 128,000 with it, but we know that was back a long time ago. We know that it's gone up since then. We know his salary is about 1 million right now, approximately. Which is, he should not be making that. He should be making his salary, if that, around what he was making back then. If we look at Anderson Cooper's salary. They're paying him $12 million a year. They shouldn't even be paying him. They should be paying him about 1% of that. I mean, this is basically where they're at. I mean, and this is as of the end of last year. So they're overpaying him. Let's check Chris Cuomo's salary. He's making $2.5 million a year. I mean, you gotta be kidding me. I mean, these are salaries that are going to bankrupt the company. I mean, you cannot spend this kind of money on people that no one watches. And the idea of traditional TV is dead. And this is something in which, when we look at the idea of media has changed, and this is something that's, I think the legacy media needs to focus on. And I think this is something that's very, very important. And when we look at the idea with it, it's not, people aren't buying into the idea of this sensational media. It's just a dying art, and they're going to have to change. And when you start to look at these salaries, the salary structures of a lot of the other media outlet, the independent and citizen media outlets, they're much different. They're a lot lower, and the pay structures are a lot different. And this is something that needs to be understood. And even with those, they're going to be adding potentially into company ownership, and that's something that needs to be understood, and that's something that needs to be looked at for these companies, for these anchors, and that's something that they're going to have to look into, and they're going to have to keep with people that are actually going to be loyal to them for a long time. And because the idea of this sensationalism, it's going to have to die. They're going to have to change the whole thing with it. And if these people can't change, they're going to have to just let them go. Because when you have people like Don Lemon really he's just useless when it comes to being a journalist. He comes out with these insane conspiracy theories, like especially when it came out to the Malaysian Airlines jet. He was talking about a black hole eating it up. I mean, he's completely useless. He might as well basically go out to be serving McDonald's. I mean, he has no value on the actual market for an actual journalism. Anderson Cooper can be a daytime talk show host if he wants. Do whatever he wants to do with that. He has no value in journalism. Chris Cuomo, if he actually kind of starts cleaning up what he's doing, he might actually have some bit of value, because we've seen him ask some hard questions occasionally. So he does have some bit of actual value out there, out of the actual three that we've actually mentioned. But we're talking at CNN, most of it would have to be cleaned out, because they really don't have anything there. If we look at a lot of these stations with it, a lot of the stations don't have much. They're going to have to pretty much clean house, because a lot of them, they don't really know what they're talking about. And because you can't go with on this sensationalism, I mean, it's going to have to be very, very similar to what was happening in a lot of these communist nations when they flipped over to being capitalist, is when they were used to writing state propaganda. And it's something that needs, when they had to essentially fire all of those people and they were out of jobs, it's what happened. They were out of jobs, and they became somewhat freelance writers with it at best, but they really couldn't get any work. And that's basically what we see, is these people. That's essentially what's going to happen, is you're going to have to view it in the same light of a lot of these nations when these nations flipped. And it's going to be very, very similar to what happens in the United States, and even in some other countries, when this idea of the legacy media completely dies. And it's going to happen. Now, it might not happen all at once with it, but eventually each one's going to die, because the fact is there is this gradual flip to the independent and citizen journalism. You can't keep propping up this dying system, and eventually things change. I mean, this would be like trying to prop up old audio formats through government intervention. You can't do it. You just have to move on. Now, obviously, there's going to be with old audio formats. There's people that end up enjoying them, which end up bringing them back eventually. But I don't think this is going to be something that people are ever going to want to bring back. I think this is just going to be something that's going to be dead, and it's going to go in the history books as an actual period of a way that media was done for a little bit above a century, and it'll be viewed as being killed by an actual transition in technology. And this is about it, where we're going to end it here with it. If you like it, like, subscribe, click the notification bell, make sure you share this all the way around. I will, yeah, I'm going to end it right here, and make sure you check out my Patreon page, and if you can't donate, make sure you share it with someone else who can, and that's about it. Bye.